Hi. Thank you for coming to our first event of the year for the Our Favorite Writers series, sponsored by the Hammer and the Department of English at UCLA. I just want to remind you all that we'll be having Roxane Gay on February 12th, and then in March we have Mary Gateskill, and in April we have Alice McDermott. So I hope you'll join us for those writers as well. How many of you were alive during the Vietnam War, which roughly spanned the years between 1975 and between 1955 and 1975? Let's see. Okay, quite a few people. One of the many things I've learned from reading Viet Thanh Nguyen is that the Vietnamese call it the American War. And just knowing that one small shift somehow provides a huge opening for understanding. Though the American War, according to Nguyen, is another misnomer, as the war in question was also fought catastrophically in Cambodia and Laos. But for anyone who's lived through a war, has fought in it, or has had it fought close to one's home and been displaced by it, that war needs no name. It is always and only the war, Nguyen wrote, which is what he and his family call it. He goes on to write, the tendency to separate war stories from immigration stories means that most Americans don't understand how many of the immigrants and refugees in the United States have fled from wars, many of which this country has had a hand in. Nguyen's family, compared with the 4 million Vietnamese now in the diaspora, has been lucky. None of his relatives died during the war or disappeared at sea trying to escape. But nonetheless, their lives here were difficult. When Nguyen first arrived in the U.S. at age 4, he was taken from his parents and put into a household of American strangers who were to care for him while his parents got on their feet. He was reunited with his parents and brother and grew up in San Jose in a Vietnamese enclave. His parents opened a grocery store and worked 14-hour days, but were shot and wounded in a robbery on Christmas Eve when Nguyen was 10 years old. Still, his story is a success story. His older brother is a doctor and a professor of medicine at the University of California and was on a presidential advisory committee under Obama. Nguyen is the Arnold Chair of English and Professor of English and American Studies, that's a big mouthful, and Ethnicity at USC. He did not return to Vietnam for 27 years. He wrote, I watched Apocalypse Now and saw American sailors massacre a sampan full of civilians and Martin Sheen shoot a wounded woman in cold blood. I knew that in the American imagination, I was the other, the gook, no matter how perfect my English, how American my behavior. He attended UC Riverside, UCLA, I learned, for 10 weeks, and then went on to Berkeley, where he finished his BA and stayed for his PhD in English. His first novel, Sympathizer, won the 2016 last year's Pulitzer Prize for fiction, among many other accolades, more than I can mention here, but the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Edgar Award for the best first novel from an American author from the Mystery Writers of America, and the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature and Fiction. He also received a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2017. The New York Times said, the nameless protagonist narrator is an Americanized Vietnamese, and Nguyen's skill in portraying this sort of ambivalent personality compares favorably with masters like Joseph Conrad, Graham Greene, and John le Carré. I won't say much more about the novel, except that you will never think of or watch Apocalypse Now in an untangled way ever again. He published a beautiful collection of short stories called Refugees last year. He's also released a nonfiction book called Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, the critical bookend to the Sympathizer. Nothing Ever Dies examines how the so-called, this is his quote, for the so-called Vietnam War has been remembered by many countries and people, from U.S. to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and South Korea. The book was a National Book Award finalist, and Kirk has called it a powerful reflection on how we choose to remember and forget. He teaches an undergraduate general education course on the Vietnam War and memory, which features a multimedia component where students interview war survivors to contribute to anotherwarmemorial.com, which is something he started. His humor is everywhere present in his work, and even on his website, where he posts a useful etiquette guide for students, which advises them about how, when to email, how to use web etiquette in emailing their professors, and what to expect in the timeline of response. He named his first son Ellison, for Ralph Ellison. Immigrant, refugee, Vietnamese American. Nguyen spends a lot of time parsing these distinctions, but with a son named Ellison, there's no question that he's one of us, one of the tribe of writers. Thanks so much. Here he is.
Thank you so much for that really generous introduction, Mona, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's a real honor to be here at the Hammer. And first things first, gotta do this. Can't help it, I'm Asian. Well, one of the other things I am is that I'm also a refugee, as Mona was talking about. And the Sympathizer is a war novel, but it's also a refugee novel. And it was important for me, as I was thinking about the story of the Sympathizer, to make sure that that narrative of refugees was present, because it's such a personal experience for me and my family. So the Sympathizer is a novel about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army in April 1975, and his task is to flee with the remnants of that army to come to the United States and spy on their efforts to take their country back. But of course, in order to do that, he too has to become a refugee. So that's the first thing that I'm going to read from the novel. They end up in a refugee camp here in Southern California, Camp Pendleton, one of 4 refugee camps set up to handle the 150,000 Vietnamese refugees. And I went to Fort Indian Town Gap in Pennsylvania. But in this scene, he is going to be writing a letter to his aunt in Paris, describing for her what life is like in a refugee camp. If allowed to stay together, I told my aunt, we could have incorporated ourselves into a respectably sized, self-sufficient colony, a pimple on the buttocks of the American body politic, sufficiently collective to elect our own representative to the Congress and have a voice in our America, a little Saigon as delightful, delirious, and dysfunctional as the original, which was exactly why we were not allowed to stay together, but were instead dispersed by bureaucratic fiat. Wherever we found ourselves, we found each other. We did our best to conjure up the culinary staples of our culture, but since we were dependent on Chinese markets, our food had an unacceptably Chinese tinge. Another blow in the gauntlet of our humiliation that left us with a sweet and sour taste of unreliable memories. Just correct enough to evoke the past, just wrong enough to remind us that the past was forever gone, missing, along with the proper variety, subtlety, and complexity of our universal solvent, fish sauce. Oh, fish sauce. How we missed it. How nothing tasted right without it. This pungent liquid condiment of the darkest sepia hue was much denigrated by foreigners for its supposedly horrendous reek, lending new meaning to the phrase, there's something fishy around here, for we were the fishy ones. We used fish sauce the way Transylvanian villagers wore cloves of garlic to ward off vampires. In our case, to establish a perimeter with those Westerners who could never understand that what was truly fishy was the nauseating stench of cheese. What was fermented fish compared to curdled milk? But Out of deference to our hosts, we kept our feelings to ourselves, sitting close to one another on prickly sofas and scratchy carpets, our knees touching under crowded kitchen tables, chewing on dried squid and the cud of remembrance until our jaws ached, trading stories heard second and third hand about our scattered countrymen. This was the way we learned of the Klan, turned into slave labor by a farmer in Modesto, and the naive girl who flew to Spokane to marry her GI sweetheart and was sold to a brothel, and the widower with 9 children, who went out into a Minnesotan winter and lay down in the snow on his back until he's buried and frozen, and the regretful refugees on Guam who petitioned to go back to Vietnam, never to be heard from again, and the devout Buddhist who spanked his young son and was arrested for child abuse in Houston, and the husband who slapped his wife and was jailed for domestic violence in Raleigh, and the men who had escaped but left wives behind in the chaos, and the women who had escaped but left husbands behind, and the children who had escaped without parents and grandparents, and the families missing 1, 2, 3, or more children. Sifting through the dirt, we panned for gold. The story of the baby orphan adopted by a Kansas billionaire, or the mechanic who bought a lottery ticket in Arlington and became a multimillionaire, or the girl elected president of her high school class in Baton Rouge, or the boy accepted by UCLA from Fond du Lac. Just kidding. It's actually Harvard in the original. You guys are just as good as Harvard. Or the movie star you love so much, Dear Aunt, who circled the world from airport to airport, no country letting her in after the fall of Saigon, none of her American movie star friends returning her desperate phone calls until, with her last dime, she snagged Tippi Hedren, who flew her to Hollywood. So it was that we soaped ourselves in sadness, and we rinsed ourselves with hope, and for all that we believed almost every rumor we heard, almost all of us refused to believe that our nation was dead. So the Tippi Hedren story and the movie star story are actually true. The movie star was Viet Thanh, who was the most famous South Vietnamese actress of the 1960s and 1970s. And Tippi Hedren took such pity on the refugees that she encountered at Camp Pendleton that she had her personal manicurist come and train some of these women in the arts of manicuring, which is how 40 years later, we've come to take over 51% of the nail salon industry in this country. That's either a pro-refugee story or an anti-refugee story, depending on your point of view. And of course, I think it's a pro-refugee story. And I grew up as a refugee in the 70s and 80s. Arguably, I'm still a refugee somewhere in my mind. And being a refugee was really crucial for me. 1978 to 1988, we lived in San Jose, where I, acquired the requisite emotional damage to become a writer. And a lot of that was due to being a refugee. My parents, as Mona mentioned, had a Vietnamese grocery store. And I remember walking down the street when I was 10 or 12 years old near my parents' store and seeing a sign in a store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And that sign always stayed with me because I knew it was telling a story. And that story did not include people like me or my parents. And I think I've spent much of my life trying to make sense out of how stories operate, how stories include, how stories exclude, and sometimes in ways that are very explicit, sometimes in ways that are implicit. And one of the ways I think that stories exclude or include is around this label of refugees or immigrants. And when the Sympathizer came out, something happened that I knew was going to happen, which was that it was called an immigrant novel by a lot of reviewers, and I was called an immigrant writer as well. And I thought, that's not right. I'm a refugee, not an immigrant. And I had to constantly assert that. I'm still asserting that. And I think the reason why is because refugees are different than immigrants. And immigrants in the American imagination affirm a very basic American story, which is a story of the American dream, right? You come here, you're successful, and so on. Even if you're one of those Americans who don't like immigrants, you still believe that immigrants want to come here because we're awesome. Refugees are a completely different category. We are the unwanted where we came from, unwanted where we come to. And I think that was really driven home for me by what happened to some other Vietnamese refugees. Some of these Vietnamese refugees in the 70s and 80s ended up in Louisiana. And you remember Hurricane Katrina happened. A lot of people were displaced. And the American media at the time covered this displacement, and some of the American media called these people refugees. Now, President George Bush said, it's un-American to call these people refugees. And for probably the only time in history, Jesse Jackson agreed with him. And he said, it's racist to call Americans refugees. He was referring to the fact that a lot of these displaced people were African Americans. So I thought, wow, that's cool. We as refugees have brought America together in hating us. Because refugees, I think, are fundamentally un-American because Americans can't imagine that their country could ever be a country that would produce refugees, given what our stereotypes are of what happens to refugees and what makes refugees and what kinds of failed states and countries that they come from. And so it's very tempting as a writer of my background to simply concede that I'm an immigrant or an immigrant writer because I know that this is my entree into being an American writer. But it's also a way of containing my story. Because one of the reasons why I'm a refugee and why there's thousands and thousands of Vietnamese refugees in this country is that the United States fought a war in another country. Now we can argue about the reasons why and all that kind of stuff, but nevertheless, very complicated history killed a lot of people that brought us here. And you can say the same things for Filipinos and for Koreans. And so the immigrant story is used to give us an opening and a possibility to become American, but it's also used to cut off our history from us and allow Americans not to think about why we are here when Americans were over there. And the other reason why I keep stressing being a refugee is because there are now, apparently, quite a few Vietnamese refugees who say, let's not let in any more refugees. You know, the Syrians, Muslims, people from the Middle East, these are bad refugees. Yes, true, we're refugees, but we're the good refugees, right? And I'm like, that's not true. You're not the good refugees. You're the lucky refugees. You know, because we became refugees in 1975 when it was to the advantage of the United States to take in refugees from a communist country because, hey, we're awesome. Of course they want to flee from communism and come here. But of course there were other refugees at the time, from Haiti, for example, who were not being let in because it didn't affirm the American story. And so it's crucial, I think, for those of us who are refugees to claim that identity, to acknowledge that identity, that experience, that history, and to tell stories that embrace that and force people to confront that, including our own people, our own fellow refugees. And for me, I've spent decades trying to make sense of the history that brought me to this country. So I'll just read just a couple of paragraphs from this book, Nothing Ever Dies, that will tell you a little bit about that struggle. I was born in Vietnam, but made in America. I count myself among those Vietnamese dismayed by America's deeds, but tempted to believe in its words. I also count myself among those Americans who often do not know what to make of Vietnam and want to know what to make of it. Americans, as well as many people the world over, tend to mistake Vietnam with the war named in its honor, or dishonor, as the case may be. This confusion has no doubt led to some of my own uncertainty about what it means to be a man with two countries, as well as the inheritor of two revolutions. So that's my plight, that I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what this Vietnam War is. And it's led me to a few conclusions. One is that when Americans say the word Vietnam, what they really mean is the Vietnam War. And when they say the Vietnam War, what they really mean is the American War. And the reason why this is important is because how Americans understand this story is how much of the world understands this story as well, because of the power of American culture. You know, everybody all over the world, many people all over the world, have seen American movies about the Vietnam War, have read American books about the Vietnam War, but very few people have actually seen a Vietnamese movie or read a Vietnamese book. So let me say one more thing. If you are tempted to ask this following question, don't ask it, which is, have you seen that 18-hour documentary about the Vietnam War that just came out? Because there has never been a time when I've been asked that question, I've been asked that question many, many times over the past few months, where it didn't occur that the person who asked that question had not read a Vietnamese book or seen a Vietnamese movie. So even 40 plus years after the end of the Vietnam War, we're still faced, we who are Vietnamese people in Vietnam or abroad, with this obstacle of American solipsism about this word, this country, this war, and how this American solipsism affects us globally. But the other thing I understood about thinking about this war was that our understanding of war is problematic. It doesn't matter whether Americans or Vietnamese. I think when we think of war, generally we think of war as battles, guns, tanks, soldiers, this kind of thing. But when I was growing up in that Vietnamese refugee community in San Jose, I had a very different understanding of war. War was the fact that, my parents could not stop telling me stories about the terrible things that had happened to them in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And I was growing up in a Vietnamese refugee community where I was saturated with stories about rage and bitterness and pain and loss and anger and melancholy, because all these people had lost a war, they'd lost a country, they'd lost relatives, properties, identities, even their mental well-being. And many of them were not soldiers. Many of them were civilians and women. Right? And I have my students in my Vietnam War class do interviews with people who've survived the Vietnam War. When they interview American soldiers, what they discover is that some of these soldiers did go and fight and were traumatized and so on. And a lot of these soldiers sat on a base, guarded a ship, never saw anything bad. But every single Southeast Asian refugee they encounter, that they interview, has a traumatic story to tell. And to me, these are war stories. You don't have to be a soldier to have a war story, right? If you've lost your country and been forced to flee and lost relatives, these are war stories. And so that's why I think of the Sympathizer as not an immigrant novel, but as a war novel and a refugee novel, because it talks about refugees, but it also talks about war even after the war has actually ended. So for me, war, it was clear. Wars did not end simply because we declared them to be over. And in Nothing Ever Dies, I say all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. And in growing up in San Jose, California, I could totally see that the Vietnamese refugees, men and women, soldiers and civilians, were still fighting this war. And that my understanding of war had to expand so that it was more than about the battlefield. It was about what Maxine Hong Kingston talked about in her story, The Brother from Vietnam and Chinamen. He said her brother served on this Navy carrier, never saw combat, but she said, this is a war story because we're all implicated in it, those of us who pay taxes. She uses this image, when we open the refrigerator, Dow Chemical makes the coolant for the refrigerator, and Dow Chemical makes Agent Orange. We're all implicated in war, but we don't want to think about that. We don't want to think about the fact that war is boring. We'd rather watch Apocalypse Now or American Sniper. That's what we're up against. And that's what I feel my work is up against, is to try to get us to rethink what it is that war means and how we tell stories about war. And Mona mentioned Apocalypse Now, and certainly when I was growing up, this was a very formative experience for me. And I watched Apocalypse Now when I was 10 years old. Age inappropriate, right? Well, that was because my parents were working 12 to 14-hour days, and they didn't have time to supervise what I did with a VCR. Apocalypse Now wasn't the worst of it, I can tell you that. But I was someone who loved war stories in the conventional sense. I loved, John Wayne and cheering for American soldiers and everything, so I picked up Apocalypse Now, I thought, cool. And I was cheering for the Americans until about halfway through when they killed Vietnamese people, civilians. And I was traumatized. I was split in two. And I don't think I realized how fully traumatized I was until 10 years later I was in college and recounting this story, this movie, to a classroom, and I felt myself shaking with rage and anger. And I knew then, just like I knew with that sign, another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese, that stories mattered, that our work as writers matters, to try to transform stories that people take absolutely for granted, whether it is that America is for Americans, or whether it is that the Vietnam War means a certain kind of thing. So when it came time to write The Sympathizer, I felt, I have to take revenge on Hollywood. And so, for better or for worse, my narrator, after he leaves the refugee camp, becomes an authenticity consultant on the making of a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now. But if Francis Ford Coppola or his lawyers are to ask, is not Apocalypse Now. And it literally isn't, because it's actually really a compendium of all the American movies about the Vietnam War. And I saw pretty much all of them in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's an exercise I don't recommend to anybody. So this movie is called The Hamlet, and it's about American Green Berets who are dispatched to the Central Highlands in Vietnam to train the ethnic minorities to defend themselves against communism. And my narrator has read the screenplay and sent his notes to the famous director of this movie that's going to happen. And the director is known only as the auteur. And in this scene, they meet for the first time and discuss the notes that our narrator has provided on this screenplay. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said, a little more realistic, a little more authentic for a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say, instead of having your screenplay direct, as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language? Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something, instead of simply acknowledging that there is some kind of sound coming from their mouths? Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean. Ching Chong English? Just to pretend that they are speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The auteur grimaced and said, "Very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question." "What was it?" "Oh, yes. How many movies have you made?" "None." "Isn't that right? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thanks very much for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas." It's been an interesting experience that after the book has come out, I've met with quite a few Hollywood people. And none of them dispute this characterization. Okay. I confess to being angry with the auteur. But was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that Montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are Montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru or the Nung or the Tay. "Let me tell you a secret," the auteur said. "You ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit." He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient, imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created, with all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priests understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, better to be villain, loser, or anti-hero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb. So then when the novel came out, another thing happened that I knew was going to happen. The novel was reviewed in the New York Times, which I didn't know was going to happen. But in the third line of the review, which was a very good review, the reviewer said, "Viet is the voice for the voiceless." I was like, no, that's not true. Have you met any Vietnamese people? We're very loud. The problem is not that we're loud or that we don't have stories, as I knew from growing up in San Jose. The problem is no one wants to hear them. Certainly not Americans. We're inaudible when we speak in Vietnamese. And even when we speak in English, we're still hard to hear. Because if you do a Google search for Vietnamese American literature, you'll find 15 or 20, at least, other people writing in English before me. So there was already voices for the voiceless before me, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be another voice for the voiceless after me as well. So to be called the voice for the voiceless is actually not a compliment, and yet it's something that is used often to describe writers like me, writers from so-called marginalized communities and so on. And it's not a compliment because what it really means is that people in the majority audience really only have time for one of us. So that's, I guess, me right now. But that's fundamentally wrong. Because even if we're all Vietnamese, it doesn't mean we're all the same. We're all quite different. We have thousands and thousands of stories. So even if I think my stories are good, I have no delusion that the story speaks for everybody. And so the voice for the voiceless idea is simply another way to keep us in our place, to let one of us have the limelight and not deal with everybody else. So true justice in storytelling and literature and representation doesn't happen with yet another voice out there. It happens with us taking over the cultural industries and every other industry as well, to make sure that there's representation everywhere, including behind the scenes, so that we have thousands of loud and noisy voices to deal with. So I wrote the Refugees, the short story collection before the Sympathizer, and it was explicitly with this idea that there's not one singular Vietnamese experience. That even if I'm writing about Vietnamese people, that doesn't mean I know them. I had to create an Excel sheet. So I thought, okay, here's a story about a guy. Now I've got to write a story about a woman. Here's a story about somebody straight. Now I've got to write a story about someone who's not straight. I mean, literally, I wanted to make sure that I didn't mistake my experience for the Vietnamese experience, that there would be a diversity of stories in my own collection about Vietnamese people. And so the initial story, I'm just going to read a couple pages from Black-Eyed Women, the opening story, is about someone who's completely not like me. Fame would strike someone, usually the kind that healthy-minded people would not wish upon themselves, such as being kidnapped and kept prisoner for years, humiliated in a sex scandal, or surviving something typically fatal. These survivors needed someone to help write their memoirs, and their agents might eventually come across me. "At least your name's not on anything," my mother once said. When I mentioned that I would not mind being thanked in the acknowledgments, she said, "Let me tell you a story." It would be the first time I heard this story, but not the last. "In our homeland," she went on, "there was a reporter who said the government tortured the people in prison. So the government does to him exactly what he said they did to others. They send him away and no one ever sees him again. That's what happens to writers who put their names on things." By the time Victor Devoto chose me, I had resigned myself to being one of those writers whose names did not appear on book covers. His agent had given him a book that I had ghostwritten. Its ostensible author, the father of a boy who had shot and killed several people at his school. I identify with the father's guilt, Victor said to me. He was the sole survivor of an airplane crash, 173 others having perished, including his wife and children. What was left of him appeared on all the talk shows, his body there, but not much else. The voice was a soft monotone, and the eyes, on the occasions that they looked up, seemed to hold within them the silhouettes of mournful people. His publisher said that it was urgent that he finish his story while audiences still remembered the tragedy, and this was my preoccupation on the day my dead brother returned to me. My mother woke me while it was still dark outside and said, "Don't be afraid." Through my open door, the light from the hallway stung. Why would I be afraid? When she said my brother's name, I did not think of my brother. He had died long ago. I closed my eyes and said I did not know anyone by that name, but she persisted. "He's here to see us," she said, stripping off my covers and tugging at me until I rose, eyes half shut. She was 63, moderately forgetful, and when she led me to the living room and cried out, I was not surprised. "He was right here," she said, kneeling by her floral armchair as she felt the carpet. "It's wet." She crawled to the front door in her cotton pajamas, following the trail. When I touched the carpet, it was damp. For a moment I twitched in belief, and the silence of the house at 4 a.m. felt ominous. Then I noticed the sound of rainwater in the gutters, and the fear that had gripped my neck relaxed its hold. My mother must have opened the door, gotten drenched, then come back inside. I knelt by her as she crouched next to the door, her hand on the knob, and said, "You're imagining things." "I know what I saw." Brushing my hand off her shoulder, she stood up, anger illuminating her dark eyes. "He walked, he talked, he wanted to see you." "Then where is he, Ma? I don't see anyone." "Of course you don't," she sighed, as if I were the one, unable to grasp the obvious. "He's a ghost, isn't he?" So I don't really like ghost stories. Might be one of the reasons why it took me 50 drafts over 17 years to finish this story. And I think, number one, because it didn't break me as a writer, I became a writer. And then the other reason why it took me so long was because I was wrestling with what it meant to be haunted, both by actual ghosts, but by figurative ghosts. And I grew up in this Vietnamese refugee community knowing that people were haunted by their pasts, and that they had never stopped thinking, either about the war or about the country that they had left behind. And so that sense of haunting, I think, for me, is pervasive in the refugee experience. Maybe immigrants, having chosen to come to a country, find it easier to leave things behind. But I think refugees, anybody who's been traumatized, been forced to move, remain haunted for a very long time over what happened to them and what was left behind. So that's what I'll read one last bit from the Sympathizer that touches on this idea of ghosts and haunting. So my narrator and the rest of these refugees, yes, they're traumatized by their past, but if there's one thing that characterizes South Vietnamese people, is that they love to have a good time. Sing, dance, drink, smoke, all the good stuff. And so one of the first things these refugees did after they left the refugee camp and moved to Los Angeles was to open a nightclub. True story. So it's set in this next scene is set in the nightclub, and our narrator is about to fall in love with the one woman he should not fall in love with, Lana, the daughter of his boss, the general. Now known by just one name, like John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Mary, Lana stepped on stage, clad in a red velvet bustier, a leopard print miniskirt, black lace gloves, and thigh-high leather boots with stiletto heels. My heart would have paused at the boots, the heels, or the flat, smooth slice of her belly, naked in between miniskirt and bustier. But the combination of all three arrested my heart altogether and beat it with the vigor of a Los Angeles police squad. Gotta laugh not to cry, I think. Pouring cognac over my heart freed it, but thus drenched it was easily flambéed by her torch song. She turned on the heat with her first number, the unexpected I'd Love You to Want Me, which I had heard before sung only by men. I'd Love You to Want Me was the theme song of the bachelors and unhappily married males of my generation, whether in the English original or the equally superb French and Vietnamese renditions. What the song expressed so perfectly, from lyric to melody, was unrequited love. And we men of the South loved nothing more than unrequited love. Cracked hearts, our primary weakness after cigarettes, coffee, and cognac. Listening to Lana sing, all I wanted was to immolate myself in a night with her to remember forever and ever. Every man in the room shared my emotion as we watched her do no more than sway at the microphone, her voice enough to move the audience, or rather, to still us. Nobody talked, and nobody stirred, except to raise a cigarette or a glass, an utter concentration, not broken for her next, slightly more upbeat number, Bang Bang, My Baby Shot Me Down. Lana's version of Bang Bang layered English with French and Vietnamese. The last line of the French version echoed Pham Dui's Vietnamese version, We Will Never Forget. In the pantheon of classic pop songs from Saigon, this tricolor rendition was one of the most memorable, masterfully weaving together the love and violence in the enigmatic story of two lovers who, regardless of having known each other since childhood, or because of knowing each other since childhood, shoot each other down. Bang Bang was the sound of memory's pistol firing into our heads, for we could not forget love. We could not forget war. We could not forget lovers. We could not forget enemies. We could not forget home. And we could not forget Saigon. We could not forget the caramel flavor of iced coffee with coarse sugar, the bowls of noodle soup eaten while squatting on the sidewalk, the strumming of a friend's guitar while we swayed on hammocks under coconut trees, the working men who slept in their ciclos on the streets, kept warm only by the memories of their families, the refugees who slept on every sidewalk of every city, the sweetness and firmness of a mango plucked fresh from its tree, the girls who refused to talk to us and who we only pined for more, the streets and homes blown away by bombshells, the men who had died or disappeared, the shadows cast by candlelight on the walls of wattled huts, the barking of a hungry dog in an abandoned village, the sight and sound of orphans howling by the dead bodies of their mothers and fathers, the stickiness of one's shirt by afternoon, the stickiness of one's lover by the end of lovemaking, the stickiness of our situations. And while the list could go on and on and on, the point was simply this. The most important thing we could never forget was that we could never forget. Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, I read somewhere that you hadn't been back to, and you left at age 4, that you hadn't been back to Vietnam for 27 years. So that would have made you, 31? And I was thinking that surely you were writing quite a bit before then. I wondered, I had also read that Kazuo Ishiguro, who left Japan as a very young child, hadn't gone for a long, long time. I think he was even older when he went back. But I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about that first trip back. I don't know if you've taken many trips back, but
Well, I was very...
how was that first trip?
Well, it was a very scary experience, but for different reasons than why my parents took a long time to go back. I think people of my parents' generation, many of them feared going back to Vietnam because of communism, and they were enemies of communism, and they thought terrible things would happen to them. The funny thing is, my parents went back before me in the early 90s, as soon as they could, and they'd been away for 20 years. And I'd grown up with my parents telling me, we are 100% Vietnamese, or you are 100% Vietnamese. And they go for 2 times, they come back, and over Thanksgiving, my dad says to me, we're Americans now.
That's funny.
Yeah. So I went back in 2002, several years later, and things had changed a lot by then. It was more developed and everything, even though it was still poor. And the reason why I was afraid was because, my relationship with being Vietnamese is kind of fraught, because I'm very deeply steeped in the Vietnamese refugee community and feel myself to be very Vietnamese. For example, I never changed my name, even though I had the opportunity to do so. But I knew that Vietnamese people in the United States looked at me and thought, he's not very Vietnamese. He's a banana, because his Vietnamese is not very good, and he likes to do stuff like study American literature instead of become an engineer like real Vietnamese people do. And so, but I also, there was this gigantic country of people, who were very different from me, and I had an adopted sister who was lost when my family fled, and so there was all these family problems and connections.
Was she ever found?
Well, I mean, she was lost in the sense that, she was left behind. But she stayed exactly where she was left, which was in Ban Ma Thuột, our hometown. And,
So by now you've all seen her.
Yeah, I saw her, but not the first time. The first time I was too frightened. The first time I said, I'm going to go back as a tourist, just to get dip my toe in the water. So we went, and, as a tourist, Vietnam is great. So I went for 2 weeks, had a blast.
Did you go to where your family was, or no?
No. Well, number one, it's off the tourist track. So, and number two, I was like, I'm just not emotionally prepared to have this reunion yet with my adopted sister. Yeah,
Had your parents seen her yet?
They did.
Before this?
Yeah, they went on their trips back, and because I grew up with one picture of my adopted sister in the family photo album, and this was the it was a wallet-sized picture. This is what my parents carried out of the country, and I grew up knowing that there was someone missing from our family. So when I spoke about that sense of haunting, I grew up with that. I really felt that there was an absence in our family. I knew who this person was, knew her name, had this picture of her when she was 16 years old, which was when we left, and that this was like a ghost in our family because my parents did not want to talk about this situation. And so it was really hard to sort of just get up the willpower. And then I also, so I went back for a second time and I stayed for 7 months because I studied Vietnamese formally in the university and everything, just to get ready for this trip, the second trip, to meet my adopted sister and all my other relatives, many of my other relatives.
Wait, you mean you'd study Vietnamese in the university here?
No, I studied Vietnamese in Vietnam.
In Vietnam,
Yeah.
so you went in preparation. So you went where? Where were you studying Vietnamese?
I spent 4 months at the National University in Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon.
And that was before you went to meet your...
Yes, I wanted to make sure I at least had some better language proficiency. So, and then I also wanted to go to my quê, my homeland. So for the Vietnamese people, the quê is where your parents come from. And my parents came from this small rural northern village about 30 minutes from where Ho Chi Minh was born, which is famous for producing hardcore communists and hardcore Catholics. Guess which side I came from. And so I was all ready to go back and go there because all my paternal uncles were still there living in my grandfather's house.
Wow.
And lo and behold, my parents didn't tell me, after I spent 7 months studying Vietnamese, they didn't tell me, we speak a different kind of Vietnamese in this village. I was studying formal Vietnamese, academic Vietnamese. I show up, and the word for water is different, for example.
That's hilarious.
I was like, oh my God, I'm not ready for this.
That's very funny.
And my wife's like,
how many dialects are there?
Oh, many. I mean, there's like 3 major regional ones, but then there's all these many like local ones as well. And so my wife was like, after she visited the village with me, she's like, now I understand why I never understood your parents. And she's Vietnamese too, and that's because I speak this really weird local dialect that nobody else speaks.
Wow. And then how long were you in your village?
1 night.
And?
I couldn't take it. It's like, there are some Vietnamese refugees who go to Vietnam, they're like, I'm going to live in the village. It doesn't matter if there's no running water, no toilet, or whatever. I'm like, I'm a refugee. I came out of a refugee camp. I don't go camping. I don't go swimming. I don't go anywhere without a flush toilet, And, and so, but it was also a very funny, kind of a sad and funny experience. But I had one cousin who actually left the village. She married a rich guy in Hanoi, and my parents for 20 years had been sending money home to all the relatives. And this is partially how they survived during the years of, there was like famine and starvation and rationing and all that kind of stuff. So this cousin was very grateful for all of that, and she'd married this rich guy. So they picked me up when I came to Hanoi from the airport. They came to my hotel, and they showed up in like a gigantic, expensive Mercedes. And I had planned to go to the village on a train, but my cousin-in-law, I guess, said, no train for you. We're going to take the Mercedes, But he was going to do it on his time. So we didn't even get there until like 9 p.m. at night because he was just taking his time, And so we showed up, and I walked into the family compound. There's like 25 to 30 people waiting for me at night, But my cousin was like...
And were you able to talk to them?
Yeah, in a sense. Vietnamese people talk a lot generally, so they'll make up for the silences and all that. But there's a lot just of a very basic stuff to talk about before we get into like all the emotional nuances and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And have you been back to your village since, or just that once?
No.
That's very interesting.
I know you're supposed to say, "Gosh, I really," I know you want the sort of ethnic origin story. I went back and I reunited with my family, and everything was awesome and all that kind of stuff. But, I went back with the explicit idea. It's complicated, and I went back knowing I was not going to fall to the ground and kiss the soil of Vietnam and become 100% Vietnamese or anything like that. And yeah, it's complicated. And I am still dealing with it.
Does the term of being a refugee ever expire?
Well, that's a good question. And I go around saying...
I don't mean that in a political sense. Of course, there are plenty of...
I think it does expire in a political sense because
it does expire in the
in the sense that
sense.
Okay, so when you become a citizen, you're probably not a refugee anymore, right?
Uh-huh.
But that's why I brought up the example of Vietnamese people now who were refugees who go around saying, "Don't let the Syrians in." Now that's a political choice that they've made. That's why I think it's a political choice to claim your refugee past, as I try to do. But emotionally, I think that being a refugee, who knows when that expires?
How does it work generationally? Now you have a son.
Well, for example, I grew up with a sense of deprivation, and that was from a refugee experience.
And that's probably all bound up with your sense of your ethnicity. It's all one.
Ethnicity, warfare, Catholicism,
refugee, all that.
Yeah.
And what will he have of that?
Well, for example, so I grew up. We were actually not poor when I was growing up. My parents actually became very successful merchants and everything, but they acted like they were poor. Okay. And so I grew up feeling, like deprived. And so I have a son. He's 4.5 years old, and he gets a lot of stuff, But still, I try not to give him certain things. Like Legos, for example, And
you mentioned this before. Is there some particular animus you have with Legos?
No. It's just that he really wants Legos. I mean, that's what his heart desires.
So that's why.
That's what his heart desires. Legos
so you feel it's
and TV shows.
Yes, deprive him of that.
I feel it is. I feel like, okay, you get all the food, all the clothes, all the books. You get everything I didn't get, and he does get Legos and stuff. But I feel like I got to deprive you on something, just like my parents did. And so when I tell him, like, do you know why you're not getting these Legos you asked for? And he says, yes. And I said, why? He says, because you're a refugee. But I feel like if we don't do this, how is he going to know? Because it's so easy to become Americanized, where then he's third generation? He'll grow up just thinking he's some kid in L.A. who gets everything he wants, right?
And there's already enough of those.
There's already enough of those. And I don't want him to lose. I don't need him to feel like he's got to support his heritage or whatever. But he has to know what his grandparents went through, and what his parents went through, so that all the privileges that he's going to get, he's going to hopefully have some sense of humility and awareness about that. So we can't really deprive our children of privileges, but we should at least let them know that they're privileges, which I think a lot of kids don't know.
Yeah. Although, of course, it's different to sort of manufacture deprivation. That's a question so many of us have is,
Well, my parents could have afforded to give me Legos, but they decided not to.
That's interesting. You
know what they gave me?
What did they give you?
An organ. Okay.
Oh, what do you mean, like a church, a large
An
organ?
electric church organ. My parents
Catholic.
liked music.
We
They're Catholic.
remember.
So they thought, oh, wouldn't it
There's
be
a
cool?
lot of music in the
Yeah,
Sympathizer.
but they said, wouldn't it be cool if Viet could play religious music at home? I was like, no, it would not be cool.
Did you go to Catholic school?
All my life.
That explains a lot. Let me ask you, I wonder how much of that is the Vietnamese and how much of that is the Catholic school. But I wanted to ask about your relationship as a writer to the majority culture. I think one of the great scholars one of the Asian scholars, King Kok Chung at UCLA, pointed out all the allusions to Vietnamese American and also Asian American literature, not only Vietnamese literature, in your book. But there are also a lot of allusions to, just American literature. I saw some Roth in there. There's some Ellison in there. There's quite a, and how do you parse all that?
Well, I think I was ready for it because I'd written The Refugees first, and that was a book I learned how to write fiction through, and I think I was very much imitating. I was like, oh,
The Refugee.
The
Did
Refugees.
you really use an Excel sheet?
I did.
That's so interesting.
I
And
did. It'll go into my archive somewhere.
How did you decide the categories you felt were
Well, because
essential?
I'm a good politically correct person. So like men, women, gay, straight, old, young, all that kind of stuff. I mean, seriously, like that's something I did learn from all of my experiences as an activist. I was an Asian American activist on campus, and I was an ethnic studies student. And so I take seriously this idea that, at the very basic level, identities matter. So it does matter if your stories include people of XYZ backgrounds. And it does matter if you decide not to talk about diversity and you decide to, only focus on one group's experience. So that was just a basic decision I made. But I was also a very anxious writer because I was just learning how to write, and I was worried, okay, am I going to get published? Will I win a prize? Will the New Yorker take a story? New Yorker never took a story, but I was worried about all that. And so I was...
Have you tried lately?
I don't write short stories anymore, so it's not
Never again?
Yeah, I hope not. God, it was a horrible experience writing this book. But it doesn't show up. When you read it, it's a lot of fun, and it only takes a couple hours. But what happened after that was then I wrote The Sympathizer, and I felt much more confident. So then I could take a lot more risks and do what you're saying, which is incorporate. I wanted to write a very ambitious novel that could fit into different kinds of canons: Asian American, American, international literature. And so there's a lot of writers and books that I was thinking about that I wanted to refer to and have a conversation with.
It's an interesting notion, all these different canons. I think I loved what you were saying about the sense that, I don't know, the sort of exceptionalism idea, the feeling that, okay, the majority of readers will take one Asian American or one kind of female voice or one kind of transgender experience, and it's a question of reciprocity, because I don't know, certainly as a female writer, I grew up reading centuries worth of men, and I have no problem with that. I love reading centuries worth of men, but I wish they would read us too, and I think that's probably, and I love the resurrectionist work you've done. You do a lot of work. You've brought up a lot of in your writing. You've written about a lot of other Vietnamese American writers, which is extremely useful, I think.
Well, there's no doubt that we who are not of the majority, however you define it, race, gender, power, sexuality, have to do twice as much work. Because we have to know everything about the people in power, and then we have to do our own stuff too. So, like in just an example of literature, I have to know the English literary canon. I've read Beowulf, Chaucer, Shakespeare, all that kind of stuff, but I'm pretty sure that most English literary scholars haven't read very much Vietnamese American literature. And so that's a huge obligation, and that's a huge burden, but hopefully it makes us better.
Well, sure.
Because we know more.
Yeah, exactly. How could it, one doesn't not want to read it, I would think.
But I also have to work against my own prejudices too, So that's why I had the Excel sheet. Because, and this sounds very crude, but how do you know your own prejudices unless you chart them out?
how do you know them even to chart them out? How did you go about figuring out your own prejudices? Isn't that one of the major struggles we all have all the time, is figuring out our prejudices?
Well, there's no excuse today. There's no sentient person in the United States.
I bet we all have plenty of prejudices.
Oh, no, we know. But we know what those prejudices might be. Like, so it's not like we have to invent new prejudices. It's like, what? There's racism and sexism and homophobia. Okay, so you
No,
make
but they
these
get more
categories.
subtle. They go underground.
That's why we still learn. So, that's why I learn from students and from people who are younger than me, like trans issues. This was not a thing when I was growing up.
No.
It was hard enough just to even acknowledge, homosexuality. I had no idea when I was 17 or 18 that there was such a thing as gay people, right? I had to learn a lot. And so now we learn new things.
Well, you were in that Catholic community too.
I went to an all-boys school.
Yeah.
There was huge numbers of things we didn't know.
But
you,
probably you were surrounded with as well.
I absolutely am certain of that. So in retrospect, you see these things. But there are people who take prejudice seriously and people who don't, right? But that doesn't mean they don't know that prejudice exists. They just decide they're not going to deal with it. So there's plenty of people, who know that literature should include all these writers of different backgrounds. Doesn't mean they're going to read them or make an effort to know or to track what they're reading and not reading. So for me, it was important to say, okay, of course I'm going to gravitate, not of course, but I do gravitate to male writers. So let's make a conscious effort, to make sure that my stories also include women, or that I'm also reading stories by women as well. And
that is really
things.
interesting, isn't it? I mean, the level of identification that is involved in reading. But let me ask, I know the audience has a lot of questions, so I'm going to shut up in a minute, but I have one more question I wanted to ask, which had to do with your interesting, intriguing comment that came from Maxine Hong Kingston about how we're all very much related to war, and I think she meant something broader. I think she meant to American imperialism and all kinds of political national decisions. But we don't want to think about that because it's boring. Well, I mean, that's interesting because, we do have stories about war, but aside from that's a slightly different thing that's a slightly different problem from making an Americanized view of the war in Southeast Asia. It's also a problem, the level of drama, and aren't we all, even as fiction writers, how do we avoid that? How do we avoid that central sensationalistic nature of storytelling and the falsification it inherently brings?
No, I think you're absolutely right. There's that argument that anti-war movies are not really anti-war because even if they depict the fact that war is hell, they get us all excited about watching these
and
movies.
a lot of the juice they get and a lot of the excitement is from portraying exactly what they're.
So I think there's two responses. One, of course, is that then you do have to acknowledge what the content is. So that's why I'm saying war stories should include more than just battles and soldiers and so on. They should include women and civilians and all that kind of stuff. But the other question is a formal.
Women are soldiers now too. Women are soldiers.
Women are
now
soldiers too. Yes, and then of course, then we complicate it. It's not okay. So for example, the New York Times recently had a very heartwarming story in their wedding section on two Army captains, both guys who got married to each other. And it's like, these studly dudes are so cool. They're Apache helicopter pilots. They're killers, but they're lovers too. That's a problematic story, right? Okay, but good, we've advanced. We can have gay killers, hero, lovers, but they're still part of the military-industrial complex. Can we talk about that? And but the other issue is a formal decision. Can you write a boring story?
Right.
With a Sympathizer, I wanted to write an exciting story,
right.
but it gets stuck in exactly the problem of identification and thrills that you're talking about.
Okay, I know the audience has a lot of questions too. We have one little complication here, which is the Hammer generously puts these up on their website. So if you don't mind, if we can have the lights come down, we'll take questions from the audience. But please, I'll call on you and then wait till the microphone comes to you. Who has a question? Don't be shy. Let's start with you right there. Wait, but wait till the microphone comes. Thank you.
When I was in Vietnam, I was really taken by how warm and receptive they were to these Americans who did so much damage. How do you explain that forgiveness?
That's actually a very common reaction among Americans who go back. A lot of trepidations, obviously, about the war and all that. And I think Well, one is that you're rich. Personally and collectively, they want the tourist dollars personally. That person who's, nice to you. But collectively, Vietnam wants money, foreign investment from Vietnam, from the United States, Korea, so on, willing to let bygones be bygones. You've got to remember, South Korea, for example, lost 5,000 men in Vietnam, 300,000 South Koreans served. They did a lot of bad things. They were more terrifying than American soldiers. But it's all bygones, let bygones be bygones right now between Vietnam and South Korea because of huge South Korean investment. So there's money. But secondly, I think that there is genuine warmth. I think many people, not all people, the people you're likely to encounter as a tourist, have wanted to put the war behind them, especially if they're young, because they want to go towards the future, and they don't want Vietnam to be a war, not a country. But the other complication, and one of the reasons why I think it's harder for Vietnamese people to go back to Vietnam, is that for us, it's not that simple. We don't necessarily get the nice and fuzzy embrace when we go back because it was a civil war. In addition to being a revolutionary war, oftentimes divided families, and even if it didn't divide families, there could still be bitterness because some people got out of the country and some people didn't.
Yeah.
So you go back as a fat Vietnamese American, and they're like, well, there's maybe some resentment there, And so for me, I'm treated as an American when people want my money, and as a Vietnamese when they want my affection, right? And so it's very complicated terrain, I think, for many overseas Vietnamese people when they return to Vietnam.
That makes sense. Could you bring the microphone? Thank you.
I was just wondering, you mentioned that most of the people who ask you about Vietnam haven't read a Vietnamese book or seen a Vietnamese movie. What would you recommend? Who's your favorite Vietnamese writer, and what movie do you think people should watch?
Good question.
Well, I could go on for a long time. If you look up my name and New York Times and LitHub, there's like 2 articles I wrote with like 10 to 15, sources. But just a couple. Probably the best novel of the Vietnam War from the North Vietnamese perspective is The Sorrow of War by Bao Ninh, which is a classic of war literature, regardless of what war you're talking about. T. Bui's The Best We Could Do is being read by UCLA right now, I believe. I blurbed it. It's a fabulous memoir of Vietnamese refugees in San Diego, California.
A graphic novel.
Graphic novel. I love comic books, and we're doing some great work in comics, Vietnamese writers. Film-wise, Journey from the Falls on DVD, and it's an epic about the fall of Saigon. It really looks like an epic, right? And what else is out there? The Rebel by Charlie Nguyen is about French colonial Vietnam, also on DVD, also a very wonderful film to look at. But there's many, many, many others.
Your website also has a number of
Probably.
recommendations. Can we get a microphone down here? Thank you.
At what point did you decide that you want to be a writer, and what made you feel that you have something to say and there's an audience to hear what you want to say?
Good question. Well, I think I wrote my first book in the 2nd or 3rd grade. Lester the Cat, illustrated story about a city cat who decides to live in the country and falls in love with a country cat. Won a library prize. Thought, well, maybe I have something to say. But it took a long time to get serious about it, and I think that it took decades to gradually get the discipline together until in my 30s I could really concentrate on writing fiction. And in terms of audience, I thought, I'm the audience, but people like me. Aren't there other Vietnamese people out there who are hungry for stories like me? Aren't there other Vietnamese people out there who feel like our stories aren't being told and we're damaged and hurt and outraged as a result? And that was, when I got to the Sympathizer, I got to the point where I had also felt that even though that audience was important, my people, that still could not be the primary audience. The primary audience had to be me for the Sympathizer, because there are a lot of Vietnamese people, I think, who would object to the Sympathizer. So if my primary audience is Vietnamese people, but they refuse to read my book because it's from the perspective of a communist spy, because they're anti-communist, or they refuse to read my book because it attacks communism at the end because they're communists. What am I supposed to do? So I write first for myself, and then next for Vietnamese people, and then everybody else after that.
We have
wonder what's next in your literary career. I know you've been in France, and is your next novel in a French setting? And does it deal with Vietnamese refugees in France?
Yes. The next novel is the sequel to The Sympathizer, and it picks up exactly where The Sympathizer left off. Well, I guess he lives, so obviously, sorry, for those of you who haven't finished the book or read the book. He's half French and half Vietnamese, which I very deliberately made him so in that novel, so that I could bring up the history of French colonialism and of Vietnamese racism. And so in the sequel, I wanted to, just more explicitly confront that history of France and French colonialism and have him confront that part of his past.
You had a question.
So, as a writer, when you write about other people's identities, because you said you wanted to write about various Vietnamese people, how do you determine how you want to represent them, and how do you draw a line between how it's appropriate to represent them, and maybe realizing that you are not these identities?
Well, sometimes, I like in The Refugees, because it's a set of realistic short stories, I was very much interested in that idea of can I represent people empathetically as characters? And that's an emotional exercise. It's an artistic exercise that all of us as writers have to have. We have to have empathy, and we have to have imagination, and then we have to imagine a very different kind of human being. But sometimes like the people who are closest to us are the hardest ones to imagine. Like your mom and dad, you live with them every day, but do you really know them? They piss you off all the time. How are you supposed to empathize with these people? So that is a very difficult exercise. But then, if you're also asking how do you write about people who are different from you demographically, a lot of it is due to, I think, open-mindedness, thinking about other people and what they're like, but also doing the research. So there's stories in The Refugees that are not about Vietnamese people. And I was very deliberate about doing that, because I wanted to demonstrate that, number one, Vietnamese people don't just live with Vietnamese people. We do meet other people, and they come into our lives, right? And I also wanted to demonstrate as a writer that I could write about other people besides Vietnamese people. But the impetus behind The Sympathizer was quite different, because it's a very different kind of book. It's a very political book, very satirical book. And in that case, actually, I was not always interested in the idea of depth. So there was a lot of stereotypes, deliberately exploited stereotypes in that novel, because I was working with a very different aesthetic. I wanted to work with caricatures and types of people. And so in that case, I didn't have to worry about making sure that everybody was represented empathetically, for example. Sometimes I wanted to mock people in The Sympathizer.
You have the person in the hat.
Thank you for this opportunity. I have a really simple but complicated question. I wonder, you mentioned you have to go through the double tasks of checking the Western literature canon, and there is a comparative perspective to that. And also there is a brief narrative of your encounter with Hollywood producers. So my question would be, how you deal with burning out and hypocrisy in terms of who you are and doing what you are doing, the things you are up against. Because in a certain sense, I'm an Asian woman of color getting my PhD in Asian and comparative studies, and I have encountered similar situations. So I do not know if you could provide some insight and morale support in terms of dealing with that.
Okay, how do you prevent burnout and turning into a sellout and a hypocrite? Gosh. Number one, I know it's very difficult to be an academic of any kind in this environment, especially in the humanities, especially if you're a minority, especially if you're a woman. And so I think that for me, what was really crucial is knowing that there were others, that there was solidarity, that there was community, that there was coalitions. And that's why, for me, I always when I was an undergraduate, I was an English major and an ethnic studies major, because something like English really prioritizes the individual and makes a fetish out of alienation and isolation. Whereas ethnic studies compensated for that for me by emphasizing collectivity and solidarity. And so I always, going back to your early question, why do I write about other Vietnamese writers and so on? It's because I believe in that. I believe that we need to acknowledge our genealogies, the people who have come before us. We need to support the people who are with us now. We need to bring up new people as well. We need to continue building on foundations that have already been given to us. And so that is not really... That can burn you out, but if you build a community, it helps to prevent that, because you can share the work and get the support. And it also, I think, helps you from being a sellout and a hypocrite, because I do think about, well, what is King Kok Chung going to say? Or what are one of my fellow Asian American activists and artists and intellectuals going to say? Am I when I write this story or when I do this work, am I taking a shortcut? Am I doing it in order to placate the powerful people who can publish me or give me a promotion or something like that? And of course you can negotiate. Doesn't mean you have to go out and burn the university down or something like that. But it also means that you don't give in and do exactly what it is that the folks in power want you to do. So with the Sympathizer, for example, I wrote a book that I knew was doing something politically that was objectionable to many Americans, even if they didn't know it. Okay. So, for example, it's a story about disillusionment with communism. That's a whole genre in the United States. And you know how that genre ends? Welcome to America. Here is your Happy Meal. And that's how I'm absolutely certain that's how people expected my book to end. And it doesn't do that. And I can't help but think that's why 13 out of 14 publishers rejected it when we sent it out. And it's not just because it was written in a certain way or the style was alienating or something, but I'm sure it had something to do with the ideology of the book and how it worked against this very basic ideological assumption of the American dream, which saturates so much of what we do, and it has its variations in all the different disciplines and all that kind of stuff. So you have to know what you have to, in order not to sell out, you have to know what selling out actually means. Because I think many people would not think that writing a story that affirms the American dream is selling out. But it's a very subtle way of getting people to capitulate to power. So.
Okay, one more question, but then right afterwards, Viet has agreed to sign some books upstairs in the bookstore, and is it upstairs or is it right outside? Anyway, he's going to sign some books, and we can talk to him then. Let's have one more question. Let's have this man. Yes. Seemed very eager.
Hi. Thank you for calling on me. And also thank you for writing the book. It was a really powerful experience to go through that kind of literary journey. And my question is about, talking about the style of the book and how the style actually kind of served an ideology. And I wanted to know your process of kind of discovering how the book was going to be written as a confession, and then how at the end of the book, the narrative conceit actually kind of transitions from confession into, like, for lack of a better word, like an A plot, right? Where you're with him in the day and he's on his way to the rest of his life. And then the follow-up to that would be, how are you going to write a sequel when the Sympathizer was primarily a confession?
Well, so when I wrote the novel, when I set out, I knew immediately it was going to be a first-person narrator because it fits the genre of the spy novel and so on. And then when I made that decision, my next question to myself was, well, whenever I read a first-person narrator, I always think, who is this person talking to? And of course, most of the time we just have to agree to the fictional convention that we are there being spoken to in some way by this narrator. But I felt that intuitively, that was not enough for me. That I was also struggling intuitively towards a book that would also grapple with the nature of narration itself, and that the book would have to be metafictional or meta-narrative. So I made a decision from the very beginning that this narrator is speaking to somebody, a real somebody in the world of the book. I don't know who it was. I didn't know who it was at that point. but I just had to trust that eventually I'd figure out who it is he's talking to. And about 2/3 of the way through the book, and I had the book plotted out, but I knew the ending was not the ending I wanted to get to. About 2/3 of the way through the book, I realized, oh, I know exactly where he is and who he's talking to, because there's only one logical narrative conclusion to this story. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but he has to end up where he ends up, you know. And that it was a confession, since you already gave that away. And this confession worked perfectly because it was from one Vietnamese person to another Vietnamese person. And what this meant was that in this kind of a narration, you don't translate. Like one Vietnamese person speaking to another Vietnamese person is not going to say pho, a delicious beef noodle soup, you know. But the implicit demands of the American literary marketplace for minority writers oftentimes makes them write to an implied audience that is the majority. And I was not going to do that. I refused to do that. But I had to find a fictional way to make it happen in the book. And then your last question about how do I do this in the committed, I'm trying to figure that out right now. Okay. Thank you.